So, welcome back, folks, to another episode of the Profitable Sheep and Goat Production Podcast. My name's Leon Gaiman, and I'm with Lost Creek Wholesale. I also have my friend Matt along again today, and today we have a special guest on, Megan Filbert, from a company called NoFence, a virtual livestock fencing company. And she's going to tell us a little bit about NoFence, how it works, etc. I'm anxious to see what we can learn. Maybe I can quit building fence for something different. So, Megan, tell us a little bit about yourself and about NoFence.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on, Leon and Matt. I know about this podcast, very happy to be here. So, myself, my name is Megan. I am an Iowa native. I now live in Wisconsin. And for many, many years, I worked with farmers to help them adopt cover crop grazing specifically in the upper Midwest, in row crop country, but also help farmers address barriers to just get more livestock on the landscape, more grazing. More grazing is good. And in that journey, I probably have heard farmers tell me at least 1,000 times, I can't graze cover crops because I don't have livestock. I don't have livestock anymore because I don't have fence. Right? We've removed a bunch of fence on the landscape because to make way for larger row crop acres potentially, or just because it's in disrepair. And farmers are aging and not really willing to put more fence in and raise those livestock again. And at the same time I was hearing this across the state of Iowa, I had heard about this concept of virtual fencing. And that was probably 9 years ago now. And I heard about it from Australia. And then, there was some research in the United States out on rangelands that started back in the 70s. And so I started looking into that some more, and my mind was blown when I first heard about it. And I started incorporating a slide in my presentations to beef producers on, what if, this is the future. I know it sounds sci-fi, but what if we're able to adopt virtual fencing on a large scale? This would really answer so many of these questions and obstacles that we're talking about right now. And as I introduced the concept of virtual fencing, I would just see like rooms full of beef producers' jaws just drop. And that's when I was like, yeah, I had that same moment. I get what they're feeling. Like this, we're onto something here. This technology is truly um one of the answers. So, um, in 2022, I worked for an organization called Practical Farmers of Iowa before I worked for NoFence. And we put on this big conference for farmers, and I was responsible for the livestock sessions for that conference. And there was a lot of interest in virtual fence, so we created a session on virtual fence and contacted the CEO and inventor of these NoFence collars from Norway. It's a Norwegian product and a Norwegian company, and asked if they'd like to virtually give a presentation. And they said, how about we just fly over? We would like to explore breaking into the United States with our product. And so that's kind of how that all started. And so NoFence specifically, like I'd said, they're European. They're a Norwegian company founded in 2011. And they've been selling commercially in Europe for about 10 years. And we just went commercial in the United States as of last July 2024. And prior to that, in the US, I shepherded a 2-year pilot program with about 45 producers around the United States. It started in October 2022. And the objective of that pilot program was to test different management scenarios with our cattle, sheep, and goat collars, but also test cell connectivity with our technology in all the different regions of the United States, because we know that cell service is not perfect in many, many places. And so that's one thing I'll just say up front is that NoFence is a little bit different of a company than some of the other virtual fence companies. One, because we're the only company that currently makes a small ruminant collar. But two, our collars connect to an app on your phone over cellular networks. So there's no base station or tower involved like there is an option or a requirement for some of the other virtual fence technologies. And so I just like to say that up front that cell service, decent cell service on about 75% of your grazing lands is necessary to have a good experience with our product.
And what company?
So we have agreements in place with almost all carriers in the United States. Um, some of those are roaming agreements. And so what I'll say is that our callers work best with AT&T and T-Mobile, and they work the least with Verizon. And so there is a detailed conversation to have with certain folks who may have some spotty connectivity or know they only get connectivity through Verizon. But essentially, it boils down to the callers connecting to the nearest cell phone tower to your farm.
So, and maybe you will dig into this a little bit later, but do you see that same technology going forward, or do you see any changes to that?
So, awesome question. There's always changes in telecommunications in our country, globally. So there will always be, I don't think cell phone service is going to get any worse. It's
Right.
only going to improve. And that means more satellites, more towers, etc. So what we know is that in the future, we've heard, we know that Elon Musk has created Starlink, which is satellite internet. There's also talk of satellite cell networks. And
Mhm.
so that means more satellites in our atmosphere instead of more towers on land, cell towers on land. And I would say that in the midterm future for us as a planet, there is going to be enhanced cell connectivity globally. And so I'm thinking like, the next 3 to 5 years.
Yeah.
And supposedly what that will mean is no dead spots anywhere, like in sub-Saharan Africa, right? Like
Right.
cell service everywhere. And what that means is that's just incredible for all virtual fencing companies worldwide.
It's opening the door drastically,
Exactly.
making it, yeah. So
Yep.
I don't know where you want to go with this conversation, but I'm already thinking maybe we should talk a little bit about what this no fence is before we get too much farther. Like tell us about the actual device and what it's supposed to do.
Good idea. Let's go through like basics 101 of
Okay.
how it works.
Yep.
So you create virtual pastures and you move your animals from pasture A, B, C, and you monitor your animals all from an app on your phone. Okay. It's a very user-friendly app. And the collars are then assigned to the specific pastures you want to assign them to. And when the sheep or goats with outfitted with collars approach the virtual boundary that you've set from your phone, the collars emit a scale of tones. Those tones increase in pitch and it sounds like beep 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 beep. And if they keep going, that is when they receive an electrical pulse through the chains around their neck. So after a 3 to 7 day training period of when those animals learn to associate that audio as a warning to the consequence of the electrical pulse, after reinforcing that for up to a week, that's all they need. They are trained and they can be fully virtually fenced. And after an effective training period, they're almost always just turning away from the sound and not getting an electrical pulse.
Yep.
It's very rare for them to continue getting pulses.
So it's kind of similar to an underground dog fence,
It is
except
exactly that same concept, except nothing's buried.
right.
Mhm.
Yep.
Really cool. What, and then you can move those boundaries as you want to, and the animals will just figure out like, hey, when I'm getting close to this side, it's not beeping anymore. I can go further this way.
That's exactly right. So as frequently as you wish, you can edit those boundaries and give them a new strip of grass, whatever that looks like. And as long as those animals are not hearing the audio cue, that means they're safe and they can be there.
Yeah. And I think that's the most exciting about this is the ability to rotational graze, moving once an hour if you want to, and never going out there and moving fencing. I think
That's
that's
exactly
a
right.
yeah, awesome
So
concept.
it all comes down to obviously cost savings of physical fence infrastructure
Mhm.
if you have to build more fence or if you want to graze areas that previously are unfenced. The second is the labor savings of what you're saying, Matt, of being able to rotate however many times a day that you wish without physically being there. You could be doing it from a beach in Mexico, actually. Um, anywhere in the world where you get cell service and can access your app, and as long as your animals are in an area of service, you can be moving them. Um, and then the other piece of this equation that most of our customers actually say is like the number one value is the quality of life and peace of mind that they get from being able to receive real-time notifications if anything's happening, whenever an animal's getting an electrical pulse or escapes, or just open your app 20 times a day if you want to set virtual eyes on those icons which represent your animals. And they're all GPSed. Every collar has a GPS receiver, so you know where they're at all times.
Yeah.
And just that, it allows you to have a better night's sleep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Maybe this gets away a little bit of what it actually is, but I can't wait to ask. I know most of the virtual fencing companies so far have still recommend that you have a perimeter fence up. Is that what you guys are recommending as well?
Yeah, so how I like to explain that is that virtual fencing was not invented to replace 100% of physical perimeter fence.
Mhm.
It absolutely was invented to replace cross fencing, interior fence, but you as the producer have to take into account the risk and the liability associated with where you're grazing, right? And so we would still always recommend some sort of perimeter fence along a busy highway if you have cows grazing there,
Sure.
right? Or sheep or goats.
Sure.
But many no fence customers are grazing difficult terrain, so like on the sides of mountains,
Yep.
in the woods, where those animals are probably never going to see a car or maybe even another human. And the risk of them escaping is much lower. Like
Sure.
that's a low risk grazing scenario than next to a highway. And because you get a real-time notification of an animal escaping, at
Mm.
least you can respond to that emergency immediately,
Yep.
right? So it is
Yeah.
truly up to the producer to take on that risk, use their discretion.
Mhm.
I would say that even in high risk scenarios, because you're potentially pairing physical perimeter fence with virtual fence, there's redundancy built in the system now, and maybe you need two strands physical perimeter instead of five,
Yeah.
right? So I think no matter how we look at it, there can be a reduction in physical infrastructure.
Yeah, and I never even thought about that. Well, if your animals get out, you can see right away that they're out. That would be huge.
You get a text.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
So just
That's
right there, that is life changing for a livestock farmer, right? It's completely game changing.
yeah. Because
Yeah.
we do some cover crop grazing with our sheep, and that's always my biggest concern is when we're out on other farms away from home. Um, if the sheep get out, they might be running all over town before I ever find it out.
Exactly. So it could
That's
be
my big,
hours. And how far can they get in hours? Oh, really far.
yeah.
Yeah.
Would that just a thought that crossed my mind. Would it notify you if there is a lot of unusual movement, meaning your sheep are running a lot, meaning a dog or something's chasing them?
So the notifications that you get are every time an animal gets an electrical pulse or escapes. But at the same time, the collar is tracking animal activity levels. And so we haven't built in notifications for decreased activity levels or increased activity levels, but that's coming down the pipeline. We are going to build in actual notifications for that. But basically, it's up to you to go to your app and look at those activity levels and use them as a proxy for my animal is in heat or it's lame or getting sick. But usually, in the case of like a dog chasing them or a pack of coyotes, that's going to result in an escape.
Yeah.
And in an escape situation, um, your phone's going to blow up with notifications that every single caller has escaped, every single animal, because you can name each caller your animal name, ear
Mhm.
tag number, whatever it is. So every single animal is going to show escaped, and that's when you know, okay, they're obviously something's happened. They're out of forage and they're really hungry, or they're being chased by the neighbor's dog and their GPS. So you that's when you leave your house and you go directly to them
Yeah.
or come back from town, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Makes
then
sense.
one other thing that's important to mention is that let's walk through the scenario of just one or two sheep from your herd leave, but not the whole herd. So that based on herd mentality, ruminants want to return to their herd. So we just say if it's one or two animals that you see just saw escaped, wait 5 or 10 minutes. Most likely they're just trying to get some green stuff, on the other side of the fence, and they'll want to come back. And in the case of re-entry, there's no consequences. They don't get any audio cues, they don't get any pulses. It's a one-way gate, basically, and it lets them back in. And then you get a notification that says Bessie has returned and is reactivated in her pasture.
What happens? So when they get out, do they continue to get shocked? I'm thinking, in a scenario where they just blow through the fence and are running all over the place. Obviously, continuing to get shocked isn't going to help the situation any.
Yes.
Any.
Yeah.
How do you have that set up?
Thanks for asking that detail, Matt. So, how that works is when your animals are going to escape, what happens is the collar goes through that scale of audio cues, beep, 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 followed by an electrical pulse 3 times. It repeats 3 times, and then the collar shuts off essentially. It doesn't stop working, but it's not going to give any more audio cues. It's not going to give any more electrical pulses. For animal welfare concerns, we obviously don't want to keep pulsing an animal, right?
Right.
So at that point, after it's gone through three, that is what classifies it as escaped, and that's when you, the producer, gets a notification that animal number 555 has escaped.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Yep, yep.
And then when that animal returns, that's when it resets, probably.
It resets automatically, and you get a notification that says Bessie has returned and is reactivated in her original pasture.
Yeah.
So that's all automated.
So now it makes me curious. Do you have a livestock guardian dog option now that like to go along with this setup?
Great question. Get that question all of the time, all day long. Um, so NoFence currently does not make a collar for a livestock guardian dog, nor sell our collars for LGDs. And that is specifically because there has been many years of research that went into getting these collars legally approved for ruminant species such as cattle, sheep, and goats. We are a European company, and shocking animals is like very, very strict with animal welfare compliance in Europe. And so for us to prove the use of these or design it potentially a different collar fit for a dog will just take more time regarding the legal approval side of this
Mhm.
and the research that we'd like to do on animal welfare.
Mhm.
And so not to say that it's not on the map on in the future. It's just that we don't have the resources yet to do it as we're scaling in the United States. So we do know of some of our pilot farmers, for example, who use spot on or halo, actual wireless dog fence, fence collars,
Right.
um, paired with no fence with their sheep and goats. It's not a perfect solution, but that's what people are trying. And
Sure.
so that's where we're at right now.
In a scenario where you do have perimeter fence, the dog probably is going to stick with the stock if it's a good one, and if it does patrol the entire pasture, doesn't really matter anyway.
Right. You would
And
you would set the dog if you're using a different system for the dog, you would set that on a larger perimeter
Exactly.
right,
because you can't go into two apps and move them
yeah,
at the
Exactly.
same
You would
time.
let the
That's
dogs have a larger roaming zone.
yeah.
yeah.
Yep.
And in a low risk situation, which you mentioned, like range land, the dogs maybe don't need a fence anyway, depending on the situation.
Exactly. It all depends on that dog, how bonded it is,
Yeah.
how willing it is to come back. I get the same exact question for donkeys, horses, llamas, alpacas, you name it, any other sort of like guardian species.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
How often does it happen that predator pressure pushes them through boundaries?
Okay, so how I will answer this question is that we have recently, our data scientists have recently looked at all of the data for our 150,000 plus callers that we have deployed in Europe and the United States. And so out of all of, and those have logged about 700 million hours of graze time. So out of all of that data to look at, animals with no fence have spent 99.3% of the time inside their virtual boundaries and 0.7% of the time in escape mode. Most likely they came back, but
Mhm.
there was time spent escaped.
Right.
So, okay, that's an indicator
Mm-hmm.
of how often they're leaving due to potential predator issues. I will also say anecdotally, we know that like in Norway and some places in Europe where there's wolves, there's been cases of, let's say, a wolf pack, um, you know, chasing a pack of or herd of goats, flock of goats. And what the customers have told us is that they think their goats were able to run further and faster away from those wolves because they themselves were not impeded by electronet or whatever physical fence would have been there. And then because they're getting that real-time notification and they're all GPSed, they went directly to them.
Mhm.
And yes, maybe they lost a couple kids if it's kidding season.
Right.
Um, so I always tell interested folks that, and how I do it with my herd of Kiko goats is during kidding season, um, for a month or 2 months when the herd is the most vulnerable because I'm kidding on pasture, I'm doing that closer to home and I am using Electronet. I'm not throwing away my Electronet. There are still times where hybrid fencing scenarios really are necessary. And so for that 1 month a year, I'm probably putting kind of a perimeter electronet up when the herd is most vulnerable, and then we'll go further away from home and we'll be fully virtual fenced when those kids are a bit older.
What are you finding with that training period with a new flock? Are you finding that some of the animals just don't adapt to the collars. There's some that, like even with the fence, you have some that are just knuckleheads. You're best off getting rid of them. Are you finding some of that with the collars? Like what percentage? How does
So,
that work?
yeah, awesome question, Matt. Again, I get asked this quite often. And what I can tell you is that every animal that's been trained to this system has been able to be trained, except one animal in the UK, which we found out was a deaf cow. So, deaf animals aren't going to be able to respond to audio cues, right? Which is the
Yeah,
primary stimulus, the primary cue that we're using. So it's not a matter if an animal can or cannot be trained. It's just that you have to know that your sheep and goats that are the ones that are testing your fence all the time, it's usually the same ones, right? The ones that are testing all the time now are probably the ones that are going to have, you'll open your app and you'll see the most audio cues and potentially the most electrical pulses. Like they'll still be the most curious. It is totally based on individual animal behavior, but it doesn't mean it's not holding them in.
yeah,
It just means that they got four pulses today instead of zero, like the
Mhm.
rest of the flock,
got it.
right?
Yeah.
So there's really no percentage of saying like this doesn't work on my animals. And I also want to make the point when I realized this, it was like pretty eye-opening for me. Ruminant animals have excellent sense of hearing, much better than they do of sight, right? Because they're prey animals. And so virtual fencing is using audio paired with electrical stimulus, whereas we're used to using physical fence, which is visual paired with electrical stimulus. And so why virtual fencing works so well is because we're tuning into an inherent ruminant sense that is even stronger than their their sight. And so audio paired with the electrical stimulus is even more effective than trying to contain them with the physical fence, electric fence.
Hmm.
So I think
Makes
that's part
sense.
of this like magic piece.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So you're not really calling any animals based on this one is just not adapting and it's just challenging the fence all the time. Um,
Uh, on a widespread basis, no. Like the customers I talk to have there are a couple who have said, you know, I did end up just selling or take it into auction that heifer or that steer that just couldn't really that just kept escaping even with this system, but it was my problem steer before. So I've never heard of this system creating new problem animals.
sure.
It's already the ones you've identified as being the pain.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yep. And I always say if the incentive or the stressor is great enough, animals will be willing to take the electrical pulse that the collar gives them, which is the same situation as them being willing to go through some netting,
sure. Yeah.
right? If they're hungry enough or stressed enough.
Yeah,
Yeah.
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 Actually, that would be a great way to see. Like, if you're grazing something that they're just really not liking, you're gonna pick that up pretty quick in the data that they're getting shocked more. They're pushing that
It-
boundary harder.
they're all clustered in this one corner and they're constantly getting shocked. And then you go, oh, they need to move.
Yeah,
They want what's on the other side. That's obvious.
Yeah.
yeah.
Yep.
So who's using currently, who's your biggest customer? The cattle industry or the sheep and goat? Or the
Oh,
sheep or the goat?
yeah. Great. Good distinguishing factor there. So in the United States, since July, um, 70% of our collars are on goats. Are on goats for targeted grazing.
Like
Goats that go on
goats on the
jobs.
go,
Yep.
like type
That's it.
situations.
Yeah. Yep, exactly. Because they're grazing almost impossible terrain. You know, it's so hard to fence. It's steep. It's brushy, it's woody, it's the worst fencing job on the farm, right?
And the fence for those guys that are doing that targeted grazing like goats on the go, which we actually had what's his first name? Steve
Aaron Steele?
Aaron, we had Aaron
Yeah.
Steele on the podcast early on to talk about. his business, his
Yeah.
little setup there. So those guys, fence is a pretty big piece of their puzzle.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's one, maybe I don't know if I want to call it overhead, but it is, because they're moving it all the time.
Mhm.
They're setting it up at a new place all the time. So right now, the price of these collars is going to go one direction, I think. You can
Yeah.
tell maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's going to go this way, down
Yeah.
over time. But right now, they're a good candidate for this type of setup.
Absolutely. And we work with Goats on the Go producers.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, well, let's talk about price a little bit.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
I got one more. Can I ask one
yeah,
more
yeah, of
question?
course. Yeah.
So can I, if I have 100 sheep, can I have collars on 75 of them?
Okay, let me explain that. Another great question that I get asked all day long. Okay, so we recommend for maximum effective containment to collar all adult animals in your herd. So 100% of the adults.
Right.
And that is to guarantee that containment rate of over 99%. And as soon as you start playing with the ratio of collared animals to uncollared animals, I can no longer guarantee you a containment rate of 99% because there will be animals that form other small groups, subgroups, and if they're not collared, they could be leaving the boundary, right? It all depends, again, on the individual animal behavior and then the herd dynamics of who you're collaring and who you're not collaring.
Mm-hmm.
I will also say that you all know your herds better than I do. There's always bound to be some followers within a herd that are never going to leave their flock, their herd.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they are the best candidates for not having a collar. But again, we just can't like give you that backing or that guarantee of 99.3% containment rate or efficacy of virtual fencing.
Right.
Um, I always recommend to folks like if you have a flock of 100, is there a way you could start with 20 or 30 collars on sheep that maybe graze further away from home? You don't necessarily have to start with 100. You can always scale up. And then once you see how your animals take to the system, see, you get through the learning curve of using the app for yourself, I think then you're better able to distinguish maybe 5% of this herd doesn't need a collar. But it's our recommendation for maximum effective containment for all adults in a herd to wear a collar.
Right.
Yep.
I'm just thinking about the solar industry and how, as these things get more economical, being able to move a line in a solar array would be huge.
Totally.
That
And
would be
and we,
like,
we we have so much interest from solar grazers
yeah.
because, well, I mean, a lot of times, one, I just heard a couple weeks ago that like on certain solar sites, they don't even allow any sort of interior fencing at all. And maybe that's because of the utility workers that come and go, aesthetics, I don't know, but I hadn't heard that it was like that strict, but in some places maybe. And so yeah, there are people that are inquiring about solar grazing all of the time. And
Mm-hmm.
usually solar sites have a chain link perimeter,
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
And so to not have to mess with the electronet, um, and another really cool thing within NoFence, so within the apps, all of your active pastures, you can make exclusion zones. So you can exclude any sort of sensitive areas.
Mm-hmm.
So for conservation grazing, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so like imagine that on a solar site, you can exclude like the utility pads
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
without having to, wrap a bunch of electronet around it and then have the utility workers figure out how to turn it on and off.
Yeah.
And this
Yeah,
can
I
be
could see
mapped.
that being a huge thing.
Yeah,
Yeah, and this can be mapped and saved so that the next time you come back, it's still there.
that's exactly right. So you can set create all of your pastures ahead of time and save them and then name them whatever you need to name them.
Right.
And that's all just through your app. So you're looking at an aerial view of Google Maps. You can switch between satellite view, map view. Um, and so it's a Google Map interface, and then you're using your finger as a virtual fence post to drop the boundaries. And you can have up to 36 posts or nodes per pasture. So that means you can get really creative in designing these virtual pastures. It's not like they have to just be squares.
Right.
Mhm.
Yeah.
We just say that we want you to avoid angles tighter than 90 degrees and alleyways or corridors or lanes narrower than about 60 to 75 feet because if an animal were to move their neck to one side and start getting the audio cues and then try to counteract that and move it to the next side, and if they get a second set of audio cues, that's when they become confused. Like, what direction is safe? So we ideally just want them to get one set of audio cues to one side. So anyway, there's some, tips and
Yeah.
tricks to designing pastures that we walk new customers through during an onboarding process.
Gotcha.
Makes sense. So you could even have them come back to like a kind of a home base in the evening if you
Yep.
wanted to, like have a
Yep.
virtual fence set up with a alleyway out to your the area you want to graze today, as long as you have it wide enough.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then let them so like have L-shaped pastures with that laneway off of it that
Yeah.
lead to the barn, and then overnight you can change it to a they take the same lane but go to a different
Mm,
you know pie
mm,
of the pasture,
yeah.
slice of the pasture.
Can any of that be automated? Like,
Okay, so
can I map out the week?
okay, you can, like I'd said, you can create all of your pastures and designs ahead of time and label them, and they're just there for you. We do not have the feature of pre-programmed moves yet, but again, it's another feature that it's going to happen probably in 3 months' time. It's later this year. But I will tell you that we specifically haven't started we hadn't offered pre-programmed moves up until now because it is so easy to change boundaries and move your animals through the app. It takes like 10 to 15 seconds when you want to do it, that we would rather you look at your app 5 times a day and do that and kind of set your virtual eyes on the app than have it be doing that for you in the background. But we understand the importance of some pre-programmed moves as well, and we are going to create that feature.
Mhm.
And then in that case, yeah, you could pre-program your moves for the week if you wanted to.
Mhm.
But we don't want to discourage you from opening the app and checking out what's going on,
Right.
right? We're really truly not trying to replace farmers' eyes on animals. That's the most important thing.
Right.
This is truly an aid for farmers to
Right.
enhance their quality of life
That
and
would
for soil
be
health and animal welfare, all those things.
yeah, the pre-programmed moves would be most helpful if somebody's doing really intensive grazing where they're looking to move their animals like once an hour. I mean, I know there's some guys that'll do that with rotational grazing system. Um, Even just going on your phone, remembering to do it once an hour is going to be a lot harder than if you have it pre-programmed to every hour move a little bit. The animals will
Exactly.
get used to that. I mean,
Yeah,
they'll get
exactly.
used to
They will.
the consistency of that.
Yep.
So
Yep.
yeah, that will be cool.
Yeah, we're certainly going to start seeing more folks be able to implement that high density grazing,
Hmm.
many moves a day
Yeah.
with the advent of virtual fencing. Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's
So how are they primarily being used in the UK? You said in the US, they're, mostly or 70% of them you said being used on goats for targeted grazing.
Yeah.
It, what are they being used for over in Europe?
Yep. So in the UK specifically, it's primarily cattle operations, beef, and some like dairy heifers, dairy steers. But so it's beef cattle. on perennial pastures or on like arable croplands, like crop residue cover crops.
Mhm.
But also a big thing in the UK is conservation grazing, like in public lands or land owned by different conservation trusts.
Mhm.
That's like, um, granted permission for grazing to different like local shepherds and farmers. So, and again, that's like difficult terrain, that's very steep, hard to fence, and certainly hard to make rotations through on a daily to weekly basis. And
And
so, and they call it upland grazing
yeah,
in Europe. And so a lot of like conservation upland grazing in the hills that are not used for much else.
yeah. A
Yep,
lot of those areas would be open to public use probably as well. So, not having fences out there would be a bonus.
exactly. And same as Norway, right? Everything is what do you call that? When yeah, everything's public. Even private lands, it's the right of the public to use it, to hike through it.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah,
And so it does make it a lot easier to not have to, make sure that the hikers closed the gate,
sure. Yeah,
right?
Yeah.
yeah.
Um, yeah, and that it's used quite often in that regard in Norway.
So they're using it more as a rotational grazing tool, current than the US currently is.
Rotational grazing and then that uplands grazing, like
Yeah.
kind of more extensive grazing up in the mountains that are only used for like conservation and kept in grass, they're native grasses,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
Some of
Yeah.
that upland grazing is probably similar to some of the oh, what do they call it out
The
west?
range grazing out west on Forest Service lands.
Yeah,
Is
it's
that what you're
called
Or
thinking?
BLM land.
BLM
Yeah.
land. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And
Actually, that
it may not be, Matt, you said rotational grazing. Yes, they're probably rotating, but I bet it's a set stocking for like weeks at a time, probably.
maybe in that scenario a little more.
Yeah.
Yeah. But as we're talking about it, I get into hunting a lot too, and I know that's a big conversation with their rangelands out there where they're grazing on public land is the fences are one, they're kind of an eyesore, but they're also a potential problem for wildlife that wants
Yeah,
to travel through, and the elk run through and tear down their fences and all that. So now certain points they make them have fences that they can lay down over the winter time when they're not there, and things like that. So um, that might be a way to get more support for some of the that public land grazing out there.
and there are certainly conservation groups that are latching onto virtual fencing, specifically coming at it from the lens of wildfire or wildlife migration
Yeah.
Mhm.
and wildlife friendly fences, right?
Yeah.
Another use case that I wanted to bring up because you asked about the UK is so we also sell collars in Spain. Regenerative grazing is catching on in Spain, but also Spain is a warm country. Let's equate it to California. They are having wildfire issues more and more, just like we are out west. And so we get a lot of inquiries in Spain and in California specifically about using goats for wildfire mitigation. And these collars are coming in handy.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. Let's hear a little bit about price and what's the
Yep.
lifespan of these
Yeah,
things.
Yep.
I
Absolutely.
was gonna say I think most of our listeners are probably thinking of ways they could use this. This sounds awesome. Uh, let's get to the price
Yeah,
point.
exactly.
Well,
Okay. Not a moment too soon. Okay.
my
So the
fence will last like what, 40 years? So, you
I
know.
know. So, okay. So let's break it down. So the collars themselves, the sheep and goat collars are $199 each. You also purchase a subscription fee. That subscription fee is what pays for the app, and that ranges between $3 to $4.50 per collar per month. Okay, and it's charged on a monthly basis. So you only pay for the months you use. in case you are not, in case you're just seasonally grazing.
Yeah, that was going to be my question with that.
Yep,
If you only need them a couple months out of the year, you only pay for the month you actually need them.
correct.
Yeah.
And so at 50 collars and above, we offer a subscription discount. That is when it drops to $3 per collar per month.
And it was how many collars? 55,
50 at 50 collars
50
is
collars.
when it will drop to the $3 per collar per month instead of about 450 per collar per month.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the primary cost is the collar, the hardware itself, plus the subscription, the ongoing subscription.
Mhm.
The collars come with a 5-year warranty. That warranty covers any sort of no-fence faults. And the collars have a lifespan of 5 to 7 years, is what we're saying to be somewhat conservative. It all comes down to wear and tear on the collar. If you are feeding, if your animals with collars are using a metal hay bunk, a metal hay feeder, or a concrete feed bunk on a daily basis, that's more of the collar interacting with metal or concrete infrastructure, and that could wear the collar down sooner.
Mhm.
They are definitely built to be robust. They're built for livestock. They're waterproof. Um, and so a 5 to 7 year time frame. But if, for producers listening, I would encourage you to take those costs over 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
That's what the warranty is for. So that's a guaranteed 5 year
Right.
lifespan.
And
Yeah.
and after the 5 to 7 years, is any piece of it rebuildable?
So awesome question. So we have we have minimized the um pieces that could break on the outside, basically. Like it's just there's not much that can go wrong on the outside, but there are brackets that hold the metal chains in place and there are neck straps. You can purchase, we send out new brackets if there's a bracket issue. You can purchase more metal chains in case like the ball on the end of the chain wears out. And you can purchase additional neck straps. So we've made it so you like the replaceable accessories are cheap and easy to replace.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. But
I
other
want.
than that, there's not much that can like g break or be affected on the outside of the collar.
Mhm. I guess I was thinking like after that 5 to 7 years, what's gonna go bad first? Can you replace batteries?
So the batteries also have that lifespan, that same lifespan, but yes, you can buy spare batteries, absolutely. So those are always for sale. And the thing is, we also recommend there are some accessories that come with the collar. So we recommend purchasing one spare battery per every 5 sheep and goat collars. So you always have some charged up spare batteries on hand. Spare batteries cost $49. We also recommend purchasing having some wall chargers on hand. Again, that's like one wall charger per every 10 collars. Wall chargers are $39. So there are some accessories depending on how many collars you get that increase the overall cost.
Right.
Um, when it all comes down to it, if you take the cost over 5 years, it's about 75 to $80 per small ruminant per year.
Plus the initial investment.
No, that's with the initial
Okay.
investment. So
Okay.
that
Gotcha.
that's over 5 years,
Mhm.
spreading out that initial investment over 5 years with
Mhm.
the monthly subscription fee.
Right.
So that, I mean, that can definitely eat into margins for small ruminants. Of
Right.
course it can. That is the cost that you have to weigh against your physical infrastructure savings, your labor savings, the value this brings to your life.
Mhm.
The other thing a couple different things I want to mention is that we have a producer, a pilot farmer who uses them on cattle, sheep, and goats in central Iowa. He did the math on winter feed savings. So before he had no fence, this was for his sheep specifically. He was had his animals out 6 months of the year in a lot 6 months of the year. So he's feeding bales 6 months of the year. After he got no fence, he was able to graze. He lives in the middle of row crop country, and now he's able to graze ditched grass, like the ditches and grassed waterways and nooks and crannies in his neighbor's farm, in his surrounding farming community on his farm. And so he grazed his sheep 11 to 12 months of the year instead of six,
Mhm.
and did the math on how much hay he saved. And he calculated that he saved $283 per head over one winter by not having to feed hay because he was grazing them instead with the collars. And that means the collars paid for themselves in year one in that scenario.
Mhm.
So
Wow.
like that ability for extended grazing because of new grazing opportunities, because of opening up new lands that were previously too hard to fence or not worth the labor of fencing if you're only going to get 3 days of grazing out of it, like that kind of stuff. What could you save in feed expenses and offset the cost of these collars?
Right.
I would imagine this would also fall under some of the government programs that are out there for grazing from an environmental standpoint. I'm sure there's different government programs that would help cover some of this cost.
That's awesome, Matt.
Have you
Thank you for
worked
bringing it
have
up.
you
That was
worked
my
with?
next point.
Yeah.
So, NRCS, Natural Resource Conservation Service, implemented on a federal level, implemented virtual fence cost share as of October 1st, 2024, last year. What I know is that 21 out of the 50 states have adopted it. It's, and I don't have a list of those 21
Mhm.
states. More to come. But essentially it's under EQIP. It's a 5-year contract. It's under the 382 fencing standard and the 528 prescribed grazing management standard. So you work together with your local NRCS folks to put together your prescribed grazing management plan. And I've heard of people now being told that they're probably going to be granted 75% of the upfront capital cost, whether that's collars or collars plus base stations. It depends on the company you go with. So in year one, you get a larger upfront percentage to help you, and then in years 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the contract, you get a lesser payment amount that helps you cover the ongoing subscription.
Mhm. I
So I
see.
just encourage the listeners to talk with their local NRCS folks. And, NRCS is still training their employees on this program. Not everyone is up to speed. So also you could go to your NRCS state grazing specialist to ask these questions, but they know producers want it. So please spark up the dialogue and at least this is to create awareness and just know that there are programs out there.
Sure.
And those programs need to mature, but we're at the beginning of it.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
that's
how long do those collars last then, before you have to recharge them?
Okay. Yeah, great question. So there's the solar panels are continually charging the battery. Um, and it's a rechargeable battery, but the solar panels don't keep up in perpetuity. So on average for the sheep and goat batteries, they last 4 to 6 months before needing a recharge. That is all dependent on the intensity of your grazing management and how much sun you get. And so if you are grazing, if you are moving your fence every hour, every day, that is going to presumably deplete your battery sooner than if it's a more extensive grazing situation because your animals are going to be interacting with a virtual boundary much more frequently than if they have a really large area to roam and aren't really ever hitting the boundaries, right?
Mhm. And then to recharge, like you said, you'd have some extra batteries. So you see a battery's getting low, you just go out, swap that one out.
Exactly. So every time you open your app, you could press on your caller list, and that's where you can see all of the battery life for every caller, and you can sort it by lowest to highest. And so you know, oh, these five sheep, they need replacing in the next week, let's
Hmm.
say. And so when you do that, so then you're gonna get your spare batteries that are already charged up. You're gonna pop. You don't take a collar off, but you have to restrain the animal. Pop the battery out and put one of the recharged spares in. So you want to avoid, you want enough spares to avoid having to ever take a battery out and have a collar be without a battery like overnight. We would rather not have that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it just to manage expectations for sheep and goat producers, they may need to be swapping batteries out 2 to 4 times a year, depending on if they're using them year round or not.
So the solar panel is just supplemental, basically. It can't.
Correct. It does, yeah, it doesn't provide more charge than the battery needs.
Right. So it just
But
it
but you
prolongs
will
the
see
life.
in the sunny season, um, or in like the winter, if there's snow on the ground and a really sunny day where the sun is reflecting off the snow, it almost like turbocharges the collars. So you
Hmm.
definitely will see the collars go up in charge on your app when we get tons of sun.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you had maybe said earlier, but is it the same collar that goes on cattle as sheep, or is there
It's
two different
it's
collars?
two different collars. So the
And
cattle collar is heavier. It's three
okay,
pounds. The sheep and goat collar is 1 pound. And the cattle collar has just a little bit of a different design. It fits better on a cattle's neck and it's more robust.
does it cost more?
Yes, it's $289.
Okay, so
So the sheep
slightly
and
more.
goat is 199. And
That's
the
still much.
subscription is the same.
That's still much easier to pencil on cattle than on sheep.
It is.
It is.
Yeah,
It
Yeah.
yeah,
is.
that's the challenge. Huh.
It is. I will say though that, so we broke it down and about 70% of our US users have these goat collars,
Hmm.
and mostly they're able to afford them because they have these contracted jobs,
Yeah,
right? Where
yeah,
they're getting paid per acre to use their goats as a tool. And they're not
yeah.
it's not a commercial scenario where they're making money by the carcass.
Right,
Right.
right.
And so when you can, that's how you're able to cash flow
Yeah,
in
yeah,
this system.
yeah. No, I'm trying to figure out how I can cash flow it with the on the commercial end,
I know. I
just
know.
just to put up less fencing,
I know.
and the rotate. Well, the rotational grazing part though would be there's definitely an advantage there. I'm not sure if it's a $75 a year per animal advantage, but there's definitely an advantage of being able to do a better rotational grazing
Absolutely.
job.
Yep.
Yeah.
So this might be a weird scenario, but you could
Yeah.
have somebody that had two milk goats and
You're
no
not talking
fence.
about me, are you?
You don't have milk goats. Those are
Oh
sheep.
no, milk sheet. Sorry.
I was gonna say I accused you of having goats the other day when I was down there, didn't I? Anyway, so the monthly subscription, basically they would buy that collar, $200 collar, and they'd be 450 a month for fence.
450 times two.
Right.
But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, okay, I should also say our caveat, our minimum collar order number is five.
Okay.
So just change the scenario to five
Sure.
milk cartons, right?
Or they
Yeah.
could just keep three on the shelf and two
Or
in
they
the
keep three on the shelf. Sure. Exactly. So, but yeah, that's it. Like their monthly fencing cost would cost $9
Yeah.
to the app, the subscription to the app. Yeah.
Well, and I think it would change too. Like I was thinking, usually if I have a flock out grazing, it's about 100 ewes. But if, the cost for 100 ewes is going to be quite a bit. Now the cost for 50 ewes looks more doable. So I could get enough collars for 50 ewes, and then I would have 50 ewes out more of the time with, utilize those collars with a slightly smaller flock, but utilize them better.
Exactly. So I always say that, if you can start with 20, 30, or 50 collars, could those animals be managed in their own group, their virtual fence
Mhm.
group,
Yeah,
further away from home? Like
yeah,
in the place that you have to spend more time and gas money to get to.
yeah,
Maybe, right? In some scenarios.
sure.
Or a
That's
place where you don't want to build fence.
or the
Yeah.
woods.
Yeah.
'Cause- Yeah, because I
Exactly.
was I was thinking of that too. If I'd have enough for my rams, it could move them around the farm in those little corners that we graze some, but for the most part, it's not worth putting up a fence. But hey, with something like this, you could just move them around.
Yeah.
Pretty
And I
cool.
mean, the fallback there is that now you're managing a virtual fence herd and a regularly fenced herd,
Hmm.
right? But it's the managing the virtual fence herd is very easy,
Hmm.
except you have to figure out water. You still
Yeah,
have to figure out, well, you don't have virtual water yet,
yeah.
Right.
right? Not really. So,
I wonder
yeah.
how rams would respond to that fence when there's ewes
Well,
across the
let's talk
farm.
about that a little bit.
Yeah.
So,
And wool sheep while we're on that.
yeah, let's talk about both those things. Okay, so rams, all breeding males.
Hmm.
Um, okay, if you are actually trying to keep rams away from females in breeding season or just before it, we would, again, we come back to if the stressor or incentive is great enough, they may be willing to take the electrical pulse. So the only way to be assured is if your rams are out of sight, smell, and can't hear the ladies, right? Like that's how you're going to keep them together, virtually fenced. Or else they might be willing to take that electrical pulse, just like they're willing to jump over a fence.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, we just can't guarantee it for the efficacy for those, like for animals in the breeding season.
Yeah.
Um, and maybe that's a place where you do some doubling up and there's a little bit of physical fence too. Maybe not full-blown physical fence, but some.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then in terms of wool sheep, so again, this technology was made in Norway, and there's thousands of wool sheep in Norway using no fence, and it works. The most effective time to train those animals is right after shearing. So we can have as much skin to chain contact as possible. And then after an effective training period, they're only really responding to audio cues after that, right? It's not the pulse.
Yeah.
So it works. I will say that if you have wool sheep and they're trained, and then all of a sudden you see one day like one of your sheep got 10 electrical pulses, that is a telltale sign that either their collar's too loose and they can't feel it, or that the wool has grown up and is now insulating that shock. And so can you take a pair of shears or scissors to the neck and trim up some of that wool, or can you separate it out by hand and really try to bury the chain down? Like there are some mitigation strategies there, but obviously it's not feeling the pulse enough.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Yep.
That could also shade the solar panel a little bit, maybe, if they'd get
It
really.
could. It could. People ask about it again all the time, but we haven't found that wool shading the solar panels truly makes an effect on the decline of the battery.
Okay.
It's something to pay attention to, though, of
Sure.
course.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Solar panels anymore are a lot more efficient than what they used to be. They don't have to have direct. I mean, yes, you're going to get peak performance direct sun, but
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. But they still work.
right.
And oh, again, another like benefit in the United States of these being made in Northern Europe is that in Norway they have like cloudy skies. I mean, 10 months out of the year, really. And so this was made for a very overcast environment. And so the solar panels are pretty high end in terms of being able to like retain, charge and retain battery life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In a very overcast environment like that, what kind of lifespan are you seeing till the batteries die out then? Like what's the worst case scenario that you've seen?
Well, we're constantly making improvements on battery life as well, like through firmware updates. It's like improvements that can be pushed out through the cloud to our whole fleet of collars. And so at this point, maybe the worst is 3 months.
That's pretty good. I
Yeah, it's
thought it
still
might
pretty
be
good.
better.
Uh, uh,
Might be
uh,
worse than that on
on
the.
like older firmware versions, when we were still in pilot phase in the United States, and if you're grazing in really poor cell connectivity area where it takes more battery to send messages, essentially to send out a notification, that there were some troubles. Like we had 1 month, 1 month charge, maybe even 3 weeks, depending on like how hard you were pushing your boundaries, like how frequent you were moving them, the season, and cell connectivity. But we've improved that dramatically in the last couple years. And so I would say, I mean, really on average, 3 to 4 to 6 months battery life.
Yeah, that's
Yep.
So
pretty good.
with that, what where's the technology at? Obviously, it's going to keep improving. Is there anything new that's just coming out soon that you're super excited about, or you're just looking to keep making improvements?
Yeah, so I like the things that I mentioned of being able to pre-schedule moves.
Hmm.
Um Always making improvements on battery life. Um, I, I will say that in in the future, probably all virtual fencing will include more health monitoring.
Hmm.
And so, right now we can track activity levels, but could we actually send a notification when we say you're we think based on activity levels that you is lambing?
Hmm.
And like send out the notification for it because we don't do that right now. Even though when you use your app, you use the patterns of behavior as a proxy for this. So many times we've heard from customers that um, we know that it's lambing and kidding season, and we knew that number 523 was really close to kidding, and then she just escaped. And I bet she's isolating herself from the herd to have a baby. I'm going to go check on her. Sure enough, yep, there's a kid on the ground. Right. So it's just using the behavior as a proxy for the thing that you're watching for.
Sure.
And maybe we'll hone that in a bit more and you
Something
will actually get the notification.
even being able to tell if the animal's eating, I guess, would even be.
Exactly.
Some of
Like,
these dairy guys have these ear tags that can monitor movement, and somehow they can tell if an animal's off feed.
well, so there's an accelerometer in the collars, and that's what's like being able to monitor activity level, but then also the speed at which the animal is being active.
Hmm.
And so, will we be able to fine tune algorithms to then say, this you spent 4 hours ruminating, 12 hours grazing, this many hours sleeping? Probably.
Yeah.
Yep. So
Just a
that's
matter of
like that's the future.
you just have to collect the data and feed it into the algorithm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. So,
Yep.
so most of what you're looking at coming down the pipeline is like software changes. You're not looking at a big breakthrough on new collars or anything.
On
No.
cost. Matt, that's what Matt's wondering. He's wondering
Cost,
about
yeah.
cost.
Well, I
Yeah.
mean, I've had it. We know that the cost of electronics decreases with time, right?
Yeah.
Um, Computers, TVs, all those things. So, and with more competition in the market. Yes. So, we just did decrease to prices, our prices in December as we were like ramping up in the US market. Um, and I have also had it explained to me that as solar panel technology improves, as lithium ion battery technology improves, basically all of those things can become smaller. And eventually the devices can shrink in size using less plastics, use less materials, right? Because they can all be smaller while holding the same amount of charge. That like that's we're not seeing that yet, but we can presume that that's the future of electronics,
Right.
right?
So
Mhm.
just take that scenario, for example. You take the spot on or the halo dog collar. they're pretty small, but that piece does not hold a charge very long.
Correct. That's changing out what every 10, 48 hours,
Something like that.
something like that.
It's every day or two for sure.
Exactly. And so that's not feasible for livestock, right? So that is what dictates the size of our collar,
Battery capacity.
battery capacity,
Yeah.
and the solar panel
Yeah, that
surface
battery
area.
life is.
Yep.
I'm impressed by that battery life. I was expecting it. I haven't looked into the different systems too much, but I was expecting a short
And don't you think that
battery life than that.
and don't you think that like truly like someday in our future, 10 years from now, I don't 20 years from now, I don't know, that if this can all be built into a ear tag and actually be able to keep the battery life enough to pulse an animal from an ear tag, people ask about it, like, when will this become an ear tag? I don't think anyone has the answer to that, but I think that's probably like working up to the gold standard of what this could be in the future.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Might need 2 ear tags.
Maybe I don't know exactly what that could look like. How effective is that going to be for pulsing? Do we still need a pulse if the audio is effective enough? There's just questions like that around animal behavior.
Yeah.
Will lambs all learn from their moms who wear collars, and then eventually do they just automatically respond anytime they hear a beep? And then do they need their own collar in 4 generations? We don't know yet. I don't know exactly.
Not my sheep. Wouldn't work.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, so it's constantly evolving.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's a very interesting discussion. Is there anything else you wanted to add yet? And also, if folks want to learn more about NoFence or contact, reach out to you, is there any information you want to put out there?
Yeah, absolutely. So our website is nofence.no. That stands for Norway. And when you go to our website, you can click on a button that says get started. And they ask you 5 to 6 questions. It takes about 3 minutes. You enter your information, and then that's how we receive your interest and we follow up with you.
And they do follow up because I tried it.
Okay, great. I hope that was me, Leon.
I don't think it was.
Okay, all right. Well, we have more sales staff now, so that's awesome. So we're trying our best to follow up with all inquiries. We ship collars from our Minneapolis office and warehouse, and our collars are in stock. All our inventory is, and it's a 1 to 2 week lead time at most. Right now, as the grazing season picks up, that could be postponed a little bit based on demand. But I just want to let you know that there's collars in stock because in the past we've had wait lists where we haven't had all of that inventory as we've gotten our feet under us to grow in the US. So just something to note there.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right. Very good. Well, I will put in the show notes, I'll put a link to your website there.
Thank you.
Can find you there and reach out if they have any more questions. So thanks a lot for coming on.
You're so welcome. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Super interesting.
Thanks again for listening to another episode of the Profitable Sheep and Goat Production Call, brought to you by Lost Creek Wholesale, your universal feeder distributor. And remember, if you got a topic you'd like to hear us dig into here on this podcast, feel free to give us a call at 717-310-3641 or send me an email at leon@lostcreekwholesale.net. Thanks again, and we'll catch up with you next time.